Hello everyone and welcome to H636. We are recording now in Lindome, a little south of the big city Gothenburg. And it's a lovely November day, quite warm actually to be November. And because of the warmness we have a very cute fog lying all over the place, and this is making it a bit more foggy even in here. And speaking of fogginess, I would like to take up a little bit more the lovely article made by Richard E. Lind, whom I hope is a Swede, because Lind is a Swedish name. And he wrote about the process in antiquity when the placement of the self or consciousness went from being located somewhere in the chest, sometimes referred to as the heart, and it went upwards towards the head, a process that took couple of centuries to be completed. Not only it was literal distancing, but it was also the first step into the abstract in a distant way. Abstract in the way that we were no longer part of this world. And this coincides rather well with the advent of the pre-Socratic philosophy and the move towards a polarization between subject and object and all that. Whereas I mentioned this before in a previous lecture, I would like now to put it in another format, and that is with focal setting. Because here you can see that we have a focal setting more or less situated, localized here in the chest, meaning the body, I would say, in the world. And you move upwards and you move not to a more encompassing way. It's becoming more distinct. In a way it becomes a little bit sharper. We are gaining sharpness in this process. And I think be hard to doubt that the pre-Socratic tendency was towards sharpness, distinctiveness, and definitiveness. We were no longer talking about the whole hand pointing. We are pointing with the finger now, and we are pointing to something specific. The point I would like to make here, that was a very good move in one way, but what happened is that already in the pre-Socratic era, some of the philosophers, I'd say half, maybe a bit more, they got stuck in this distinctiveness. And that was a path they took, and that was the later on dominant path, with hardly any exceptions. And what happens if you lose your path? You can stop, as you usually should, and you should orientate yourself and try to find back to the path you started with. That's the only point you can go. You have to go back to the path you started on to find your way again. But it seemed, instead of doing that, they continue to follow the new, a path made by chance, more or less, I'd say. And they followed that more and more, and they lost their original path. And this is almost like the Heideggerian amnesia. We lost the question of existence, Sein. And we need to go back to that. And now we're going to do this today a little bit by trying to show what happens when you put this distance in knowledge. When you lose the body, you're going upwards, quite literally. There is a centimeter difference, half a meter difference, but it's also coming away from the reality of the body. And what we lost was an intimacy with all that existed. Before, in the time of the Odyssey and the Iliad, we were one with the surroundings, with nature, with everything that was happening around us. And we were very much into our bodies. We felt our bodies. All the expressions almost in the Iliad and Odyssey, they take a bodily property. You have bodily fluids going through your body, you have a hardened chest, you have joints that will not yield, you have a back that's going upwards, but you also have weary knees. Everything is expressed in that way, somatically. And it's obvious somehow people haven't developed this distancing yet. What we should do is to go back to where we originated, the original path, where we had a close connection to space. And one of those things is that we tended after this development to see more to the outside of things, of the objects. They became surfaces only. They start lacking deeper dimensions, I would say. This lack of dimensionality is very obvious. Objects became nothing but surfaces. And knowledge, because this is a move of knowing. After we went up to the head, it's quite obvious, both in language and indirectly in the expressions, that it's this reflective consciousness, as Richard E. Lind also calls it. When the consciousness is up in the head, it owns the bodily perceptions. It's not directly connected to it. It's like having a bag full of money or something that signifies wealth, but it's not literally wealth anymore. And this distancing is part and parcel of technological knowledge, as I call it. This is a sort of early Vorhanden, as Heidegger would have put it. And we are going more into isolated, distinct and defined things. Second-hand knowledge, I would call it. And here it's very interesting to make a parallel to the monetary system. Because whereas money, when they developed, which took a long time before people accepted the idea that they could exchange what they had as wealth, like cattle and goods, fur, food, services, that they could exchange that for something that was more or less abstract, a piece of money, and that they would accept that to be valuable. And you can see there is a distancing going on here. We no longer have the wealth, we no longer have the cattle, we no longer have what's valuable, we have something, a proxy. And the head consciousness actually works in the same way. It's uncanny how similar it is. And this proxy of consciousness, this proxy of the self, because it's a development, it's a construction. Very handy, very practical, very good for many, many reasons, but it's not the only thing. There is a more embodied self in reality. This consciousness, this new consciousness, which is new, something argued by Julian Jaynes in his fantastic book.
The bicameral mind.
The bicameral mind and the advent of consciousness. It starts here, the consciousness, and you can. I get a feeling in the beginning it is a tool. It's something incredibly practical, like money is incredibly practical. But somehow there is a stickiness there. We get stuck in this idea. And in the beginning, this is so interesting because in the beginning it's not defined. It's not clear that that should be the path we're going to take. You can watch among the pre-Socratic philosophers, they haven't made up the mind yet. And it's the whole of the life world hasn't made up its mind yet. It's still undecisive. That decision comes by after time, and we get this lack, and it's very, very similar also to the change of the word look. I forgot the author about the guy who wrote about looking and vision, how it changed from the Odyssey and the Iliad to pre-Socratic time. But what happened, instead of describing the look, the gaze in corporal terms, the gaze was strong, the gaze was weakened, he had a questioning gaze, he had a gaze like would take him to do big deeds. That changed to that you saw something. And can you see here, which is a good word in this context, that now we had to transfer some of those properties that were in intimacy with what you did to the objects. Complicated process. Everything gets more fragmentized here, because you need to tell what's in the objects that's luring and do the action. So some of these properties got sort of divided into the object partly, and also in the newly developed subject. And that caused complications. And although I'd say that's not something that is absolute, but it makes the trap so much easier to fall in. Because as you see, we start using the word to see instead of feeling, knowing. That helps, and then you get things from all over the life world that helps to put you into that direction. And this is what I mean when we said we strolled after a different path. When all the things in the life world start changing, språkvärlden, as we say in Swedish, the language game, start changing towards the other path. That's when we took that path. That's another way of describing what taking another path is. And of course, this distinct way of looking at the world was also that thing that kept us from seeing the wholeness. Everything got divided in different small parts. And we started to look for the arche, the original substance. And I think this is a sort of predecessor to essence, if it's not already essence. Some of the pre-Socratics said it was water, others said it was fire, others said it was some tendency in matter. They all have their different arché, but what I want to point to here is the general process. We start looking for something more original. And I get the feeling the reason for this looking is a sense of loss. Loss with reality, a loss with wholeness. Because the only way we can gain knowledge is by wholeness. We cannot get it from the distinct, we cannot get it from the definitive. That is always secondary, that's always second-hand goods. Usable, like money, but the wealth doesn't come from the money. The wealth is not in the money. And people might say, what does it mean? Of course, money is wealth. Money is money on the bank, as we say. That's an old expression in Swedish and in English. Pengar på banken. That's safe. Well, let me write this sign. I'm going to write a P and I'm going to make a cross of it. It means money. In Hungarian, it's called penge. And penge in the mid-war area lost its value. It was money that had been valuable for a very, very long time. People trusted it. But what happened? People somewhere, we know it's somewhere, it is not wealth. It's still a representation. And for the representation to have a value or have its function, everybody needs to invest a little bit of their trust to it. But somewhere on this line, the trust was lost. And of course, we are habituated in believing that there is wealth in money. So it took some time, but it started to escalate. From the beginning, you could with 1 penge buy the equivalent of 3 meals. 3 meals you could get. Then all of a sudden you only got 2.5 meals. Then you got 2. Then you only got 1. And then it went quicker and quicker and quicker. In the end, for a penge, you wouldn't even be able to buy an atom of food. I think you needed the equivalent of 100 billion penge just to buy you lunch. 1 billion penge. And here you see it's still a representation. It needs to be treated as a representation. It has its use, yes, but it's not reality. It's not pure wealth. And what they did in Hungary, they disconnected the money to gold. Gold is a more firmer value. It doesn't change, or hardly ever changed in history. It's a more tacit way of wealth. An even better wealth is, of course, land and ground and what you have at home, your house. But all those things can be losing their value. But this is pure representation. It can be lost just because we do no longer believe in it. And since the damage was done in Hungary, it took a very, very long time until people started to believe in the money. And the fact is, the current money they have in Hungary, I think it's called something beginning with an F. I think it's Fanny, something like that. Forint it is. This distrust that was continued all through the post-war area. It's very hard to repair those things. And I think it was one of the few countries in Eastern Europe that still had an inflation. This is called an inflation in another word. Even during the communist era. This is quite unusual. In a planned economy you don't have inflation. The system doesn't allow it. But Hungary kept having sort of inflation. That was the remnants of this complete distrust. And if you have seen with your own eyes a person walking around with a trolley full with money, and he's still not being able to buy more than a bicycle, you start understanding what happened also during this pre-Socratic era. Somewhere our wealth, I could call it, or our richness in the objects came to go through the same inflation. They became just surfaces, tokens. And as tokens, which I will take up in the next lecture, as tokens they lingered on. The self became just a representation of the self, not the self. Because the self is in the body. It's situated in the world. And even if it might look as they meant consciousness was in the head, they didn't mean that. The movement to the head is not only a centimeter movement in reality, it's also a movement away from the world to make consciousness a pure representation. And I'd say from the pre-Socratic into modern time, that tended to escalate, and it went into language and all sorts of things. So what we lost, I'd say, here in this process was the wholeness. And I like the word in Swedish, helhet, and as well as in English. Helhet has a connection to hälsa, like wholeness has a connection to health, being whole. And it's very, very obvious here in this process. People were not whole anymore. There were complaints that we couldn't find knowledge. This token situation, they were aware of it, but instead of taking the right path, it sort of lured them even more to take the wrong path even stronger, getting more convinced this is the path to be taken. So we lost the wholeness, and that's also the reason that the very, very good philosopher Heidegger said we have to go back to that time when the question of Sein, existence, were lost. We lost the question of what exists. And it became just a token, which is called in Heidegger ontic, a representation of existence. And that lingered on until recently, I was in quantum physics, we discovered once more the true existence, the undivided wholeness. That's an expression I like very much, but you can find it from other theories like the Gestalt theory, where you say perception is of the whole directly, something we know today, but it was quite a brave theory when it came. But we always experience everything directly, not the parts, not the distinct things. After that, we can take out the distinct things. But of course, this also affected language theory, something I liked very much and still like. And you have similar, more wholeness tendencies there, like Vygotsky, which I mentioned in the past lecture. And in brain theory, you have Pribram, which I want to mention in a couple of lectures here too as well, where he doesn't mean that memories are tokens. They are representations of reality. He said instead, consciousness or the brain is a hologram of the whole of reality. And in every little part, whole of reality exists. most beautifully put by Leibniz with his idea of the monads. Monads take their knowing what you can know about them from the whole, from everything. And he describes this, that the monads, they don't have any windows that you can open and look inside and see the properties, which is exactly the idea of that the pre-Socratics almost fell into, and then finally fell into, that the properties were inside, in the essence, in the ontic existence or something like that. And it gets stuck there. Once you start opening, trying to open the window to the monad, there is no window. You'll be scratching on the surface of the monad, trying to find the window. And that's the feeling I get, for instance, of Zenon. You can feel his frustrations. He really tried to get to the essence. Where is reality? I've lost it. Because you know you lost it. So many of these pre-Socratic philosophers describe that already before Aristotle and Plato. The loss. No, nothing real anymore. But it is somewhere else. It's actually where you are. It's always been there. You never lost it in a way. You just lost your focal setting. You put your focal setting so narrow so you can't take it in anymore. So I'd say this focal setting shows that we can open up the vision and we can penetrate whatever is outside of us. We can penetrate ourselves and we can make everything knowable again. Just as we lost it once, when we lost the connection to the body, to proprioception, by putting it up in the head and making bodily knowledge very sparse, something coming out. Maybe you noticed after 2 weeks that you have a pain in your back. Maybe it's too late by then. But we need this connection to the body for so many reasons, because this is reality. This is knowledge. This is where knowledge comes from. If you are stranded by using only the tokens, well, then you could be lost with this representation of money, and money always are inflated, almost always. They lose their value by time. When I was young, I could for 1 single crown buy a whole bag of candy. Today, I'll be lucky if I get 5 candies. I'll be really lucky. I don't know what store that would give me 5 candies. And there's even a talk about giving up the crown. Whereas in my day, you'd stop a car if you saw a crown on the street. So you see, representational knowledge is not knowledge. You are being happy with something less. You can have more. And we had more once upon a time. We had contact with our bodies. We didn't have that much backache or problems with the knees. We didn't tense up because we had perception, we had proprioception, those two things, perception of the outside world, those are proprioception. And that more encompassing focal setting, I think that could be the way to heal the whole thing, making a wholeness of the thing that once was separated. Thank you.
Thank you.